back. I ask that you would please return to your seats now. I ask that those of you who are out in the foyer would come on in, please. We'll go ahead and get started with the next session. And after this, of course, we'll take our lunch break. But I'm really thankful for your attention and for all that Scott is sharing. When he was talking about Jesus paying all of our sins, I just wanted to break out into song. Jesus paid it all to him I owe. And so I'm just going to ask you, if you want to offer praise to God, let's give him a round of applause. It's all the Lord, isn't it? And I'm just so thankful for his mercy and also for how Scott has been helping us to understand that it's justice includes mercy. So, Scott, I'll let you go ahead and start the next session, and I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you. Are we ready to go again? All right. Okay, well, we are now going to get into the yucky stuff here. So we've talked about the great stuff, the beautiful and the true. And now we're going to look at the counterfeit here and see if we can unpack this a little bit. And not as joyful or happy to me to be able to have to talk about this stuff, but so important for us to try to get our heads around it, try to understand it. And I think one of the reasons I feel a particular passion about it is because, you know, unless you can understand what's going on, you can understand the basic contours or the outlines of this ideology. It really is a dominant ideology in our society now. I hate to say that. It's just important that we recognize where we're at. This is now dominating our culture. And unless you can kind of get your head around it and understand it, try to put yourself into the shoes of people who literally see the world through these lenses. You don't really know how to respond or engage effectively. You just are kind of always just wondering what's going on. And yet we've got to respond. We've got to engage. That's the moment that we're in. That's the call of the hour. So intelligent response is going to require some knowledge. We've got to get our heads around what this is. And that's really my goal here in this next session. I think we're going till 11:45. We've got just about an hour. I've got a lot to cover. So I'll do my best. And then what we're going to do in the last session is we're going to talk about our response. How do we engage? How do we respond? What do we do? How can we make this kind of practical? And then we'll take some Q&A, I think, at the very end. So you guys have been great. Well, let's start. I put up the biblical definition of justice. I want to put up again the redefinition of justice, otherwise known as social justice. And let's take a look at that again and read that. Social justice, the tearing down of traditional structures and systems deemed to be oppressive, and the redistribution of power and resources from oppressors to victims in the pursuit of an equality of outcome. So let's unpack this. Let's look at this. And I want to start our examination of it by looking at its roots. Ideas have consequences. Maybe you've heard of that famous phrase from Richard Weaver, ideas have consequences. They do. Ideas are powerful. They bear fruit in our lives and in societies. It's so important to recognize that. But ideas have antecedents as well. They come from somewhere. They have a history. They don't just spring up out of nowhere. And this definition or these ideas, this ideology has a history. And if you go back, it's not hard actually to kind of look into the history of these ideas. What you find out is that the ideas began to emerge in the 1700s in Europe. There was two streams of philosophy that were kind of in Europe at the time. One was what they called the Continental stream of philosophy. That was in the mainland, particularly in Germany. Philosophers like Kant and Hegel and Friedrich Nietzsche, they were atheists, especially Nietzsche. So its roots are in kind of this atheistic continental philosophy, which is going to be something that I'm not going to attempt to get into here today, but just to say that out of that set of ideas emerged both Marxism and postmodernism. Those come from the Continental stream of European philosophy. The other stream, by the way, was based in England. It was kind of the empirical stream of philosophy, and Darwinism and other types of ideas came out of that stream. They were both very influential in our time. But ideological social justice really does have its roots, particularly in Marxism and Marxist ideas. And so I think it's going to be helpful just to start there and just kind of refresh our thinking a little bit on Marxism. If you're like me, as I said yesterday, you kind of put Marxism out of your mind a little bit. I kind of felt like that had been thrown onto the dustbin of history, so to speak, after the end of the Cold War, right? And I was wrong. Not only did it persist in places like Venezuela and Cuba and North Korea and China as political states, but its stronghold, and this is, I say this with, it's a shocking thing to say, but its real stronghold, its ideological stronghold was right here in our own country, in our universities. The vast majority of professors in our American universities openly professed to being Marxist through the 90s, the 80s, and into the 2000s. They didn't hide that. They didn't even call themselves socialists. They said we're Marxists. And I think a lot of us didn't take that very seriously. I mean, I was influenced by that back in the 80s at Willamette, a little bit. It didn't go away. I thought it kind of did. Or I think there was this idea that once kids get out of the universities, and even though they've been taught by these Marxist professors, then they'll get into the real world, right? And they'll put that aside, you know, and they'll have to get on with their lives in the real world. Well, it didn't work out. It's not working out that way. That Marxism that has taken such deep root in our American university system is now out of the university and spilling into the broader society and shaping it. And that is the moment that we're in right now. We're seeing that incredible shaping of the institutions of our society with this ideology. So let's go back. Let's review a little bit of thinking on just basic Marxism. I'm going to call this Marxism 101. Let's put up a slide there. Marx's worldview is based on the notion that the world can be divided into two basic categories. You have on one side evil oppressors, and on the other side innocent victims. Everyone's going to fit into one of these two categories, okay? The world is going to be divided in this way. Oppressors exercise their power and their domination by establishing and maintaining a network of social institutions or structures or systems that result in their being advantaged, or the language today is privileged, they're being privileged in a variety of ways. Now, Marx limited his analysis to structures or systems that resulted in economic advantage or economic inequality between classes. So he was interested in economics and classes. That was kind of the lens that he looked through. And, you know, for him, on the side of the evil, you had these evil, oppressive systems that created economic inequalities, capitalism, and the oppressors, those who were privileged by capitalism or benefited from it, were the wealthy class, the property-owning class, the capitalists, or what he called the bourgeoisie. They were evil because they had gamed the system at the expense of the poor to their advantage. He saw the whole world through this lens. Their victims were the working class, or what he called the proletariat. They were the oppressed victims. And in his moral universe, they were innocent. They were morally good, if you will. So we talked earlier in that last session about where do we draw that line between good and evil. For Christians, for the Bible, all of us fall on one side of that line, the unjust side, the evil side. All of us are sinners. But for Marx, in his worldview, it's not drawn there, okay? It's drawn in his worldview between classes. If you're on the side of the property-owning, the capitalist class, you're evil because you've gamed the system to your advantage. And if you're on the other side, if you're a victim, you're innocent. You're good. You're morally innocent, if you will. It didn't matter, by the way, so for example, in communist Russia, it didn't matter if you were a capitalist who happened to be very generous, and you cared for the poor, and you were very giving, and did a lot to help uplift the poor. None of that mattered. Your capital, your property was still going to be confiscated by the government, given to the poor, and you were going to be thrown in prison because you were deemed to be an oppressor, an evil person, and therefore worthy of prison. Okay, that's kind of how Marxism played itself out in its early stages, Marxism 101. Now, the problem for Marxism in its early stages was that Marx was a committed revolutionary. He was convinced that the workers of the world were going to unite, right? And they were going to form a revolutionary movement and overthrow this property-owning class, this wealthy class. And there was going to be socialist or communist revolutions around the world, starting in Russia, and it looked like it was going to proceed that way. Then it was China, and we saw it happen in Korea and Vietnam, and you began to see it spread around the world. But it ran up against resistance where? In our country. It never really took root here, or in England, or much of the West. Marxism didn't take root. Why is that? Well, part of the reason is that in America, we aren't very historically, we're not particularly class-oriented. People came to America as immigrants to kind of escape, being defined by a particular class, right? They wanted to make a new life for themselves, right? The American dream. They wanted to see if they could rise based on their own innovation and hard work, right? That was kind of the idea. We can come to this country, we can create a new life for ourselves, not determined by the old world and the classes that we came from or the barriers that put upon our lives. And many of them did, right? They worked hard, the Irish immigrants, the German immigrants, you name it, Norwegians, people came from all over the world, worked hard, realized the American dream. And so class wasn't a static thing. It traditionally hasn't been a static thing in the United States. People moved, right, between classes. They didn't really associate themselves deeply with a particular class, right? There was this fluidity between classes, and that was a good thing. By the way, that's still happening today, right? The American dream is not dead. There's still some life in that idea. So it never really took root. There wasn't this kind of bitterness, if you will, this class grievance that there was in a place like Russia where you had serfs and this kind of very oppressive ruling class. So this created a problem. How can we make Marxism more, how can we say it, effective? How can we make it apply to a place like America? And this was really the challenge for kind of a new school of Marxist intellectuals that emerged after World War II in Europe, in Germany particularly. Most of them were Jewish. Some of them were just plain old Marxists. One of the earliest of this kind of new breed of Marxists was an Italian named Antonio Gramsci. And he was a committed Marxist, but he recognized that we have to move beyond just this economic analysis in order to have the Marxist revolution be effective in places like the United States, England, and the West. We have to expand it beyond economics to include other aspects of culture. And so he was really an innovator with this idea of kind of reconfiguring Marxism. He was followed by a group of theorists that have become known as the Frankfurt School, informally known. People like Herbert Marcuse, Max Horkheimer, there was a group of them. And their reboot of Marxism is sometimes referred to as Neo-Marxism, New Marxism, or in some cases, Cultural Marxism. Cultural Marxism is really what they called it themselves. Okay, that was the name that they gave for their own movement. It's to expand Marxism into beyond this kind of limited economics focus or framework into other areas of culture, other cultural divides, if you will. So they also named their project critical theory. We're going to look in society we're going to look for these places where systems of oppression and inequality exist. They're often hidden, right? because oppressors have really stealthily, kind of built these systems into society over time to advantage themselves. So we have to kind of have our eyes opened to these systems of oppression. We have to see them, and then we have to tear them down. And today we have that phrase woke, right? That's very common. And really that's what it means. The phrase woke, or this word woke, in our common parlance, is to have your eyes opened to these oppressive systems, to see them, and then to work to tear them down. So it's important that we understand that this movement of critical social theory, or later it became known as social justice. And this is where it gets confusing for Christians, because as I said, there was a history to the phrase social justice that goes back to the Catholic tradition and actually has Catholic or even Christian roots. But these social justice folks, what they're really good at is kind of branding. And they thought, if we can brand our movement of critical social theory, of tearing, of criticizing, of exposing these unjust systems, if we can and redistributing the injustice that's been done through this systemic oppression, if we can label that social justice, that'll be far better for our movement, right? It sounds much better. So they essentially captured that phrase social justice, and they put it in service of their ideology or their movement. Today, again, a lot of Christians will go, but that's our phrase, right? That's our turf, And what I want to say to them is, well, it may have been, in the early 1800s or 1900s, but it's not anymore. We've kind of lost that language. It's been taken over, it's been hijacked, and it's been put in service now to an unbiblical ideology. That's the way it's understood by our neighbors in society. We may not like that. It's happened. It's important to recognize that. Again, I am not of the opinion that we need to try to retake that phrase social justice and fill that phrase with biblical understandings of justice. I'm content to do that simply with the word justice, because justice is a biblical word. The phrase social justice doesn't appear in the Bible. And frankly, I feel like the people that have taken over this phrase have done such a good job of it and worked it into society so deeply, it's almost an impossible task. So it's important to recognize that social justice, these people were atheists. This idea is not sourced in the Bible, but it's sourced in the milieu of Marxism and postmodernism. These people were atheists, they were secularists. They assumed a world without God, without objective truth, without objective or transcendent morality. Accordingly, for them, truth was reduced to power. In other words, everything could be explained through power dynamics. The quest for power, domination, lurks behind everything. All human actions can be understood as this quest for power. This theory has, these Frankfurt School social theorists, they started in Germany, Frankfurt, but after World War II, they immigrated to the United States, and they got a foothold in Columbia University in New York. And from that foothold, if you will, that beachhead, they spread that theory, critical social theory or social justice, to universities all across the nation. And it's being taught now everywhere. That idea of critical theory has then birthed a lot of children, right? There's a lot of kind of branches of critical theory now. There's critical legal theory, there's critical women's studies, and the one that we're focused most on today is critical race theory. Critical race theory goes back to the 1980s. It was founded by a scholar at Harvard University named Derek Bell. But Derek Bell was simply taking these ideas of the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, these ideas of the world of oppressed and oppressor and systemic structural oppression, and then applying them to race. That's all he did. He's just applied it to the framework of race. So the ideas go beyond Derek Bell. They go back into Europe, into the Frankfurt School social theorists. Let's look a little bit more at their theory. Let's put up the next slide. So you can see the same basic framework as Marxism 101, but it's expanded now. You still have these categories of good and evil. You have oppressors and you have oppressed victims. Oppressors are still morally guilty. Oppressed victims are still morally innocent. We still have this analysis of class where capitalism is evil and property owners are evil. But now it's been expanded into the categories of race, ethnic minorities, or what is referred to today as people of color, are the victims. White people are the oppressors, and the system that they use to oppress people of color have different names: white supremacy, whiteness. You know, for most of my life, when people talked about white supremacy, it brought to mind the KKK, right? It brought to mind actual racists who, you know, believed in the superiority of the white race or whatever it was, these evil people. They exist. They're out there, okay? What's important to understand is that that understanding of white supremacy has now been expanded dramatically to basically include almost anyone whose skin color is white. You can be accused of being a white supremacist, or this phrase, whiteness, is kind of we'll look at what that means in a little bit. But it was expanded beyond race, also to sex. Males were the evil oppressors, females were the oppressed victims, and the system through which that oppression occurred was through what they call the patriarchy, this kind of male-dominated household idea. This is a biblical idea, actually, but it comes out of the Bible. We'll talk about authority and power in a little bit. I think it's important to talk about that. For ideology of social justice, power and authority is always negative. It's used for one purpose and one purpose only, and that is to gain advantage over other people for your benefit, for selfish benefit. I mean, there's a reality to that analysis in the world, right? For sure, right? Have people used power to benefit themselves at the expense of others in our fallen world? Yes. Have husbands used their power in the home to benefit themselves at the expense of their wife and kids? Has that happened? Yes. So there's some truth to their analysis. But here's the problem. It's not the only thing that's been happening in this world. You see, when Jesus when he talked about power and authority, he talked about it in a very revolutionary way. He didn't eliminate the concepts of power and authority, but he just revolutionized them, right? He said, yes, in a fallen world, people are going to use power and authority to gain benefits for themselves, to lord it over others. But then, remember, when he was talking to his disciples, he said, not so with you. Whoever wants to be great, what? Has to become a servant. So in the Bible, power and authority are real. God has it. We have it. I have it in my home. If you're a teacher, you have it in school. If you're a civil authority, you have it in the state. But the intention in the Bible for that power and authority is to serve those under authority for their good. That's revolutionary. And that's been working its way out in the world as well. It's ever since Jesus. For 2,000 years, people have been trying to put that into practice. But the ideology of social justice completely ignores that. It's a very dark worldview. All it's going to see is this kind of idea that power and authority are used for one purpose only, to advantage the people who have it over and against the people who don't. And then there's this other category as well. The evil oppressors are Orthodox Christians or Jews or other people who believe in traditional marriage, male-female binary, things like this. The oppressed victims are going to be what some people call sexual minorities, the lesbians, gays, transgenders, etc. They're going to be the oppressed victims. What's the system by which they're being oppressed? It's often Judeo-Christian morality. So you can see Marxism here, but you can see how it's been expanded into these other categories. That's really at the core of what I call Marxism 102, or critical theory. I want to talk now about how Marxism, both in its early form and its current form, isn't just a theory of economics or of race or of sexuality. it really is a comprehensive worldview rooted in atheism. It's important to understand that. That's why in my book, I call it ideological social justice, an ideology. Neil Shenvi, who is a Christian apologist who I've learned a lot from. You can follow Neil on Twitter. He's a really, really clear thinker, a graduate of Berkeley, studied at Duke. He's a brilliant guy. He's a chemist, much smarter than I am. He was an early Christian to begin speaking out kind of more openly and forcefully against critical social theory and the ideology of social justice. I recommend his insights completely. Anyways, he made this comment, and I thought this was so important. He said, too many Christians, because this ideology has now come into our churches, right, especially with our younger folks, too many Christians are trying to hold on to ideological social justice and the biblical worldview, but it will not work because they hold diametrically opposed visions, values, and priorities, because ultimately at the base of that, one of them believes in God and the other doesn't. So they have different visions, values, and priorities, so Christians will be forced to choose either one or another. There's a lot of Christians right now trying to hold both of these together in their universities, their churches, and whatnot. Shenvi says that's going to be not tenable. You're not going to be able to do that for long. You're going to end up going in one direction or another. Why? Because they are different worldviews. They have different religious beliefs at their foundation. It's like mixing oil and water. It's not going to work. And I think it's important for us to understand this as an ideology, as a worldview. Not just any worldview, the dominant worldview in the United States today. The one that's influencing our society more than the older Christian worldview did. That's the place we find ourselves in. Well, how did it become so dominant? How did it, in really a relatively short period of time, take over so much of society, capture the minds and the imaginations of so many people, and shape our institutions? What happened? I think this is a key question that I was asking myself. How did this happen? I think one of the answers to that is that the people that were promoting this idea, this ideology, they were very committed to that ideology. They were committed to shaping society to reflect the ideology, and they were committed for the long game. You might have heard of this phrase, the long march through the institutions, right? So you had a group of people starting in the 1950s that said, we're going to see this ideology work its way out into every area of society, starting with education. They were university professors. Through our schools of education, both K-12 and the universities, but going from that beachhead, that platform, into every area of society, media, government, politics. But we're going to start with education. And they were intentional. They knew what they wanted to do. They were deliberate. I give them a ton of credit. Let me be honest, I give them credit. They persevered. They didn't quit. They just kept chugging away over time. You know, it's what can I say? Challenging in some ways for me as a Christian to say this, because earlier generations of Christians had this same commitment to taking the truth and the power of a biblical worldview and bringing it into society and shaping society with it. But we kind of have lost that vision. Our Christianity's become very personal, right? It's become very individual. It's about me and God, me and my personal faith, and it's a passport to heaven after I die. It's very personal. It's very individualistic. It doesn't have much to do with culture and society anymore. In fact, people, even today, Christians will say Christian engagement in society, trying to shape society, it's a distraction. That's a distraction because our highest purpose is to get people saved. I'm not arguing about proclaiming the gospel. People need to be saved. But this idea that the end of our mission is just seeing people saved and not influencing society and culture and getting out of doing that, I think is part of the reason that we're in the problem that we're in today. For the last, I would say, 100 years, Christians in the United States and the West largely have stopped trying to bring their biblical worldview into society and into culture. It just hasn't been done. There hasn't been the intention of doing it. That requires intentionality. It requires discipleship. It requires training. People that are going out into law have to understand what biblical justice is, and they have to be equipped to bring biblical justice into society in that sphere of law, in education, in art, in media, in every area. That's part of mission. Again, our Puritan forefathers actually understood this. There was generations of Christians that understood this. And we know they understood this because they built great universities to do this very thing. Universities like Yale and Harvard and Princeton. They were deliberately set up to be training grounds to inculcate their charges with biblical truth so that they could go out into society and shape a society based on biblical truth. And they largely succeeded in doing that. But then, and I could talk about why we stopped doing that. It had to do with the big conflict and debate in the late 1800s and early 1900s between the fundamentalists and the mainstream churches. There was a divide there. We kind of stopped doing that. Well, guess what? While we were neglecting our mission, there was another group that they had a vision to disciple the nation. Let me just put it that way. They had a vision, they had a plan, and they were very intent and persevering in doing that. I think another reason that this has really gained so much momentum and ground in the West is that as Christianity has kind of faded, as secularism has grown in the West, as the West has become more secular, what we've seen is that secularism is in a sense, it's not a worldview. It's a negation of God, right? God just doesn't exist. But secularism doesn't really put forward a comprehensive worldview or religion of its own. It just is a negation of God. And it says things like, there is no God, there's no purpose for your life is meaningless, etc. And it becomes almost impossible for people, because we're image bearers of God, right, after all, it's impossible for people to live that way. You can't live as if you have no purpose in your life, as if there's no meaning. So you have a whole generation of young Americans who have been not exposed at all to the biblical worldview. They've never been to church. Many of them don't even know a single Christian in many of our big cities like New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. That's very common now. They couldn't tell you the first thing about Christianity or biblical worldview. They've been told that the world is secular, that there is no God, their life is meaningless and purposeless. They can't live that way. It's just there's too much tension, especially young men. Young men, God created us young men to have a calling, have a purpose, to take dominion, to do something with this world, to make it better. But they've been left with this void. Right? Nobody's telling them what to do. There's a group like ISIS that comes along then and says, we have a purpose for the world. We have a calling for your life, a calling that will give you a community and a sense of meaning. It seems crazy, but when they looked at how many young fighters moved to Syria to fight in this horrific, unjust cause, they found that many of them came from places like Chicago and London. Why is that? Because they gave this horrible Islamic fundamentalist theology, gave them a calling, a purpose, something to live for, and a community to belong to. And here I think ideological social justice has done the same thing. Let me put up a quote from Andrew Sullivan. He's a cultural critic. He's not a Christian, but his insights into culture are very profound. He said this, "For many young people, discovering new meaning for life is thrilling. Social justice ideology does everything that a religion should. See, in other words, it's not just secularism. Now it's a full-formed ideology or a worldview. It's giving answers, it's giving meaning, it's giving purpose. It does everything that a religion should. It offers an account of the whole, that human life and society must be seen entirely as functions of social power structures in which various groups have spent all of human existence oppressing other groups and providing a set of principles to resist and to reverse this interlocking web of oppression." Now you have purpose in life, right? Social justice. And I think this is part of the reason that it's gaining so much momentum in our society today. It's become, in a sense, the new religion for especially our young people. It gives them a sense of meaning and purpose. So let's treat it like a religion. Let's treat it like a comprehensive worldview or ideology. And let's unpack it in that way. All worldviews answer the big questions, right? What is real? What is true? What does it mean to be a human being? What's the purpose in life? What happens after I die? Why is the world broken? Why is there so much pain and suffering in the world? And what can be done about it? How can we respond to that? All religions, all worldviews are going to answer these big, basic questions. And what we find, the Bible does, right? The Bible has answers to all those questions. It's a comprehensive worldview. And what we find is that the ideology of social justice has answers to all of those questions as well. In other words, it puts forward not just a simple definition of justice, a comprehensive worldview. What I want to do in the next few minutes here is I want to kind of quickly look at the answers that it puts forward to these big questions. And I want to compare and contrast the answers that it puts forward with the answers that the Bible puts forward, just to compare and contrast to see the difference. So the question is, what is ultimately real? Well, the biblical worldview says what's ultimately real is defined by God, because He created it all, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the world and the earth. That's the very first verse of the Bible. In the beginning, God. God is before all things. In Him, all things hold together. He defines everything. So that's the biblical worldview. It's a worldview defined by the great God of Genesis 1:1, who created the heavens and the earth and defines all of it and gives meaning to all of it and upholds all of it. Social justice ideology is atheistic. It's a denial of God. It denies God. So all that exists is what we see on the human plane, if you will, right? And what we see on the human plane, we define, if you will, we define what's ultimately real. In other words, the human mind is the thing that defines what's real. And we have no right to question that. You might have, this is kind of a postmodern idea. You might have seen a video. There was a YouTube video that went viral a few years back that it was serious but humorous. There was a guy from the Washington Family Research Institute, young guy, who went on to the University of Washington campus in Seattle and did some interviewing with the students. And the guy was probably 6'10". He wasn't particularly tall, 5'10". He wasn't particularly tall, white guy. And he started asking students questions, interesting questions. You know, he went up to one of the students and said, "Hey, if I told you I was a woman, what would you say?" And well, the student thought, "Well, that's fine. If you want to be a woman, more power to you. I respect that. And so then he went up to another student and he said, "What if I told you I was a Chinese woman?" Well, this one was a little harder, right, for that student. They were struggling with that one a little bit, because, nowadays, right, transgenderism has made such headway into the culture, like we're not supposed to challenge somebody who says, "I'm male or female." That's, it's kind of forbidden. But this idea that you can kind of shift in terms of ethnicity, well, that's a little bit dicey. So what if I told you I was a Chinese woman? Yet the students struggled with that. They were like, "Well, if you say you are, and as long as it doesn't hurt anyone, I guess that's okay, And then he went up to another student and said, "What if I told you I was a 6'4" Chinese woman?" What would you say? Oh, this student really struggled. It's like, "No, you're clearly not 6'4". No, that's too far. And yet even they were having a hard time. You could see the struggle. And at the end of the video, this guy, he looks at the camera, the interviewer, and he says, "It really shouldn't be too hard to tell a 5'8" white man that he's not a 6'4" Chinese woman. But for some reason it is." Why is that? Well, I would submit to you that the answer to that question is that we have defined reality not in terms of God or objective reality in terms of the world that God has made, but now we define reality, right? We become the definers of reality. And whatever we say has to be kind of accepted and respected. The human mind is what defines reality. And our young people are growing up with that. They may not know about postmodernism. They might not be able to quote Foucault, but they've grown up in this milieu of ideas where it's very hard to challenge someone on objective things, like whether you're male or female, or whether you're Chinese or not, or 6'4" or not. So the human mind is ultimately real. It defines what's ultimately real. Now, think about this. In a world without God, then there's also, without God, there is no such thing as objective truth, right? We define truth, right? It's our truth. Truth is subjective. It's personal, okay? There's no objective truth. And so therefore, everything can be reduced to power. And this is one of the reasons, power dynamics on the human plane, this is one of the reasons that ideological social justice is really fixated on power. It kind of obsesses over power. Who has it? Who doesn't? Everything has to be seen in terms of these relationships of power. Why? Well, that's because in a world without God, that's all that's left. It's just kind of this power dynamics on the human plane. Let's look at another question. Who are we? The biblical worldview says we are creations of God. We're image bearers of God, a good and a holy and a loving God. And therefore, each one of us, regardless of other characteristics like ethnicity or skin color or sex, all of us have inherent dignity and immeasurable worth. As I said earlier, no worldview, no one that exists in human history puts forward this high vision of human worth and human dignity and human value than the biblical worldview. And this is why the biblical worldview, when it takes root in societies and cultures, it causes flourishing. It causes good things to happen because it has this very high view of human life. What about social justice ideology? It says, of course, we're not creatures made by God in His image with dignity or value or worth. Rather, we are primarily or fundamentally social creatures, and our identity is socially determined. In other words, we are products of our social groups including our racial groups, our sex, or our gender identity. So, in this ideology, there isn't such a thing as a common human nature that we all share. Okay? You're defined, rather, by the group that you belong to, and there's really no commonality between that group and another group. There's nothing that connects or brings any kind of unity between those groups. I remember seeing this for the first time. There was a video that came out, again, several years ago from the Yale University campus. And it was one of these videos that when I watched it, it really alarmed me, and I was like, what's going on? There was a group of students that surrounded this professor on the quad there at Yale. The professor's name was Christakis. And the students were black and Asian and, some white. And they were very hostile. They were yelling at him. They were screaming. I mean, it seemed kind of unhinged. And the professor, you could see, was really caught off guard, didn't know what to do. He was trying to engage them, as a professor would, trying to have a rational discussion, but they were having none of it. They were all about just accusing him of being a hateful racist and a bigot. And at one point in that conversation, by the way, the thing that I learned later that kind of prompted that encounter had to do with Halloween costumes. I mean, the craziest thing. But I won't tell the whole story. I mean, there was nothing to what was going on there. There wasn't some grave injustice that was happening. It was some kind of little, what they would call today microaggression, some little slight regarding Halloween costumes that created this huge blow up. And I'm looking at this, and I'm thinking, gosh, even in the 1980s, that would never happen. That wouldn't have happened at Willamette. No students would have gotten around a professor and screamed at him like that and yelled at him. And by the way, the university Yale did not back up that professor. They let him go. He got fired. Students got their way. They were empowered to keep doing what they were doing, sadly. But there was one encounter that I thought was so fascinating as I was watching that video. A black student got right up into Professor Christakis' face, like right nose to nose with him. And Christakis had said something like, I thought it was very biblical. I don't think he's a Christian, he's a Jew. He said something about being interested not in what divides us, but what unites us as human beings. I mean, it was some kind of beautiful idea like that. He said, that's what I'm interested in. And the black kid gets up in his face and he says, what were his words? He said, there's no connection between your reality and my reality. There's nothing that connects us. In other words, what defines me is being black. You're white. There's nothing that can connect those two groups. And you think about that. I think the student actually believed that. Think about how horrible that idea is. If we can't have a connection as human beings that go deeper than our skin color, if there's no way of connecting or understanding other people that are in a different group based on skin color, can we even have conversations? Can you have a civil society? I don't think so. It's all going to fall apart. I became kind of alarmed. That was one of the things that caused me to start looking into this. Nancy Pearcey is a great Christian apologist, works now down in Houston, University of Houston, or Houston Baptist University. She said this, I think this is very insightful. She said, everyone's ideas, according to this ideology, everyone's ideas are merely social constructions that are stitched together by cultural forces. Individuals are little more than mouthpieces for communities that are based on race, class, gender, ethnicity, and sexual identity. The ideology of social justice reduces, that's a key word, reduces people, individuals, to puppets of social forces that are powerless to rise above the communities to which they belong. This is a very reductionistic view of the human person. It reduces you to simply a mouthpiece or a puppet of whatever group you happen to belong to. Professor Jordan Peterson at the University of Toronto has become quite famous in a similar vein. He said, ideological social justice denies the existence of the individual. All you are is an avatar of your group interests. Think about that. If all you are is shaped by the group you belong to, Peterson is right. It's a denial of you as an individual. Why is that important? Well, it's incredibly important. The value and the worth, not just of a group, but of an individual person, is something we take it for granted in societies that have been shaped by biblical worldview. But we ought not to. I mentioned yesterday, when I was talking about words, I mentioned that book, The Gift of the Jews, and one of the words that came to us through the Bible was this word, individual. In other words, God created you as a unique person. No one else is like you that's ever lived, not just now, but in the past or in the future. You're unique in terms of your gifts and in so many other ways. God created you as a unique individual, and God relates to you not just as a member of a group. He relates to you as an individual. God came to Abraham in the Old Testament and made a covenant with him as an individual and essentially said to him, I'm going to use you as an individual to change the world. And that's the biblical view. You matter. Everybody matters. Every life matters. Now, social justice ideology isn't wrong in terms of its understanding of the importance of groups, right? Okay. We are shaped by groups. God didn't make us just as radical individuals. We're also social beings, right? God made us that way. And our groups, if you will, they define us in a very significant way. Think about your family. That defines you. If you want to know something about me, you have to know my family, my father, my grandfather, where they come from, who they are, what they valued, what they believed. That God intended that. It's a good thing. We're defined to a degree by our ethnicity, where we come from, the nations that we come from, the values of those nations. That's a good thing. So groups are important, right, for us. The Bible says right at the beginning in Genesis, it's not good for man to be alone, right? And he creates marriage. And from marriage, family. Family is a very good thing. From families come nations. All of these are very good things in the Bible. And God's going to work through not just people, he's going to work through families and nations to fulfill his purposes in the world. So, yes, we would say with the people that believe in this ideology of social justice, our groups matter, and they do shape us in powerful and significant ways. But here's where we have to disagree. They don't define us. Our groups do not define us. God defines us. We're made in his image and his likeness, and who we are as individuals apart from our group matters to God, and we ought to treat others in the same way. One of the things that you hear often now is this phrase, white privilege. And I think this is, again, it's a denial of the individual when you hear that phrase being used. Because essentially it says if you're a white person, if your skin is white, you're privileged, right? You're advantaged, in other words. You're part of that oppressor group who's advantaged or privileged through all of these systems of white supremacy and whiteness that over the years have been established and woven into the culture to advantage you in ways you're not even aware of over and against people that aren't white. You have white privilege. Well, here's the problem with that. Are all white people privileged? What if you happen to come from a broken family in Appalachia? Your parents were both drug addicts. You didn't have money to go to school. According to this ideology, none of that matters. None of that individual history or experience matters. I can reduce you to skin color, and that's the group, and I can make judgments about you on that basis alone. The individual vanishes in this world. It doesn't matter. So, or you could be, for example, the children, Malaya, the children of Barack Obama and his wife, I forget her name right now, Michelle. And you could have the advantage of going to the very best schools in Washington, D.C., all that money could buy, all the fame, and because your skin color is black, you're still going to be what? A victim of white oppression. This is the worldview. This is the way it sees it. It's a denial of the individual. The biblical worldview says, no, you can't reduce people to these categories of skin color or sex or gender identity. You can't. You have to see them as individuals. Their individual experiences matter. Okay, you can't pigeonhole people into categories of privileged or unprivileged, oppressor or oppressed, based on these kinds of things. Let's continue. I'm running out of time. What is our fundamental problem? The biblical worldview answers this question with one word: rebellion. All have sinned. All have rebelled against God and fallen short of the glory of God. Our rebellious hearts towards our Creator have resulted in a broken relationship with God. That broken relationship with God is the root of all that's wrong in the world. That's why there's violence, wars, hatred, divorce, you name it. It all is rooted in that broken relationship with the one who created us. When that relationship that we have with God was broken, other relationships fractured as well. Our relationship to one another was fractured, and we see this right away in Genesis with Adam and Eve fighting and bickering and blame shifting. And our relationship to creation was broken as well. No longer did we exercise godly stewardship and dominion over creation, but began to use it, exploit it for selfish ends. All these God-established, God-ordained relationships in Genesis 1 were fractured. The good news, right, is that through the cross of Jesus Christ and the forgiveness that he offers to us, our relationship with God can be restored. Praise God. But not only that, our relationship with one another can then be restored, and our relationship to creation itself can be restored, and we can be part of a movement, a God-ordained movement to restore, to roll back, if you will, the effects of the fall because of the cross of Christ. So that's how the Bible understands the fundamental problem with the world. What about social justice? It doesn't answer the question with the word rebellion. It answers it with the word oppression. White, heteronormative males have established and maintained power structures, or hegemonic power structures, in the words of Antonio Gramsci, to oppress and to subjugate everyone else, women, people of color, sexual minorities, and everyone else. That is the fundamental problem with the world. Because ideological social justice pins the problems of the world on a particular group of people, it is inherently racist. It's inherently bigoted. Ted Cruz, Senator Ted Cruz from Texas, recently said this. I thought it was very forceful. He said, critical race theory is a Marxist ideology that sees the world as a battle not between classes, as Marxism does, but between races. It's inherently bigoted. In other words, when you scapegoat, when you say the evil, the problems in the world are because of you, it's inherently bigoted. And it's not just bigoted, it's dangerous. It's always dangerous. That's what the Nazis did, right? To the Jews. The problems in the world are you. We've got to get to solve the problems, the fundamental problem in the world, we've got to get rid of you. This is the same ideology that led the Hutus to slaughter the Tutsis. 1 million of them in a matter of months with machetes. The problem in the world is not in here, it's over there with you. This is a tribalistic mentality that sources the problem in the world with a group of people, a group based on kind of immutable characteristics like skin color. So it's very dangerous. You don't want to mess with this. We don't want this to begin to shape our society. You know, I have to say this really forcefully here. Many people, I know a lot of young Christians, they believe they're kind of getting on the bandwagon of ideological social justice, and particularly getting behind groups like Black Lives Matter, because they see it as the next great frontier of civil rights in our country. This is wrong. This new movement is a break from the old civil rights movement. It's a renunciation of it. That old movement that Martin Luther King Jr. championed, right? What is he most famous for? He's most famous for that one phrase that he uttered on the mall, right, at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. I want to live in a world where my children are not, my daughters, I think he said, are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And guess what? That was a biblical idea, and all Americans rallied to that. And we put aside our racism of Jim Crow and of slavery, and we said, that was wrong. We were wrong. We've got to move beyond that. He's right. That was the high watermark for race relations in the United States, I believe, and that the events that followed from that. Because we all agreed, black, white, Asian, doesn't matter, we all agreed he was right. And we have to change. This is a renunciation of that, because it says we can make judgments about people, good and evil, based on skin color. That's a renunciation of what Martin Luther King believed. Let's listen to some people who are operating out of this worldview and some of the things that they say based on this. Again, these are real people. These are brothers and sisters in the sense that they're all created by God, okay? They may not be brothers and sisters in Christ, but they're fellow creations. And this is the world that they see when they get up in the morning. They put on these worldview lenses and they literally look out at the world and they see it in this way. One of them is Ta-Nehisi Coates, an essayist with the Atlantic magazine, very influential person. In fact, his books are being taught at schools all across the country. Between the World and Me is like required reading for our students in virtually every school that I'm aware of in the country. Super influential. Let's look at some of the things that he says in terms of the fundamental problem in the world. He says the fundamental problem in the world are whites. These are literally his quotes. He says, whiteness is an existential danger to the country and to the world. He says, the power of domination and exclusion is so central to the belief in being white that without it, white people would cease to exist for want of reasons. I remember when I first read that quote, I thought, wow, that's so powerful. I could see, like if you changed white for Jew, you would easily see a phrase just like that coming out of the lips of a Nazi in World War II, right? How dangerous is that? Now again, his ideas can't be dismissed as some fringe, crazy person outside of the mainstream. He writes for The Atlantic. He is regularly praised and by respected figures in our country. Evangelical pastors like Ken Weistman in Oregon, the founder of the Justice Conference, has described Ta-Nehisi Coates as must read. You have to read him. But for others, the fundamental problem in the world isn't whites. It's Christians who believe in traditional marriage and traditional sexual morality. Tim Gill is one of these people. Tim Gill is a tech titan from Silicon Valley, a homosexual man, but he's on the warpath. He's active, working in every state in the country, trying to pass what are called sexual orientation and gender identity bills. In other words, laws that would make it illegal to discriminate in any way, so to speak, discriminate against gays, lesbians, transgender. What this means is that if you run a Christian school or university and your policies uphold traditional values of sexuality and the sexual binary of male and female, that would be considered a form of discrimination, and that has to come down legally. You have to change those policies. So he's pushing for this legislation in every state. Listen to what he says. He says, we're going into the hardest states in the country. I would imagine South Dakota would be one of those hardest states in the country. He's coming for you here. We're going to pass sexual orientation and gender identity bills. This is what really catches you. To punish the wicked. Who are the wicked? Who are the evil people? Who are the problems in the world? It's us, because we uphold biblical notions of sexuality and marriage. It puts us on the side of the oppressor, wicked, evil. We have to get rid of that for the world to be made right again. And I could go on with so many quotes like this. So, what's the solution to the problem? Again, the Bible puts forward the problem this way. The problem isn't out there, right? It's not with blacks, whites, Asians, Jews, Hutus, Tutsis, males, females. It's not with them, gays, lesbians. The problem is here, inside of each one of us, in our rebellious human hearts. So what's the solution? The solution is the gospel. We have to be forgiven. We have to have this broken, rebellious heart replaced with a new heart that seeks after God, that seeks to do what's good and what's right. The gospel is the solution to the fundamental problem in the world. Well, what about social justice? Not the gospel. The one-word answer is revolution. Oppressed victims and their allies must unite to unmask, to deconstruct, and to overthrow these oppressive structures, systems, and institutions. To overthrow systems of whiteness, of Judeo-Christian morality, of Judeo-Christian views on marriage and the family, of the male-female binary. These are all oppressive systems. They all have to be overthrown. What about this question? How can we be saved? How do people, if we're on the unjust side of the equation, is there any way that we can be made right? Is there any way we can be made just again? Well, the Bible has an answer. Yes. Repent. Believe in Jesus Christ. If you declare with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Romans 10, 9 through 13, everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved. This offer of salvation is open and available to everyone in the biblical worldview. It doesn't matter who you are. Even someone who's committed evils as grave and as serious as Rachel Denhollander's sexual predator can be forgiven if they confess their sins and repent. Well, what about social justice? Who can be saved? You have a very different answer. In this worldview, victims don't need to be saved because they're already morally innocent. They don't require salvation. And you can see how this would be a very appealing aspect to this ideology, right? We all have this struggle with guilt and shame just because of our fallen human natures. Here comes an ideology that's essentially saying, I can deal with that. I can get rid of that for you. You don't need to worry about guilt or shame. You just need to claim the status of being a victim, and you're morally innocent. The problems with the world are not with you. They're not inside of you. They're with people over there, outside of you. It's very appealing in our fallen human nature. Well, what about oppressors? What about people on the other side of the equation? Can they be saved? And the answer really is kind of no. There really isn't a way that those folks can be saved. In fact, to back this up, I'll quote Ta-Nehisi Coates again, because he is a big proponent for reparations to the tune of billions of dollars. He believes that, white people, as the ancestors of slaveholders, need to pay up in order to balance the scales of justice. Black people need to be receiving the money because they were the victims, and the victimization of slavery has rippled through generations. And one person asked him at one point if that actually happened, if a scheme could be devised whereby billions of dollars of money could be transferred from white people to blacks in the United States, essentially the question was, would that save them, right? Would that level the scales of justice? Could they be forgiven, right, at that point? And you know what his answer was? White people can never be fully pardoned. And I thought that was really insightful. They can never be fully pardoned for what they've done to us. The victimization is so deep. But partial salvation is available if they will confess their complicity in the oppression, if they'll post that Black Lives Matter logo on their social media, if they'll get down on their knees before black people and they'll confess their complicity in white supremacy and these systems of oppression. Partial salvation can be available, and then they must lend their support to the revolution. And you see this kind of playing out in the society around us. I'm going to skip the next one. What is our primary moral duty? I want to, just because I'm running out of time, I want to talk about briefly this question: how do we know what's true? Well, the biblical worldview has a high value of truth. God himself is truth. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. He defines truth. Truth is very important. How do we know what's true? Well, the biblical worldview says we can know the truth, at least partially, through God's written word. God's revealed word communicates truth to us. We can know truth imperfectly through our conscience, right? The law that's written on the heart, as we talked about yesterday. And we can also know truth through God's work in creation, right? God is the maker of this world, and when we study the world through the tools of science, which is a great gift, and reason, we can understand something of God, and we can understand something of truth as well. So all three of these are ways that we access knowledge of truth. It's interesting, if you go back to, I mentioned Harvard and how Harvard was started by Christians who wanted to influence society with the biblical worldview, and the logo at Harvard University are the 3 books. If you see it, you might remember these 3 books. They're on their logo. And they represent these 3 ways of knowing truth. And at the top, they're put in an order, like a pyramid. At the top is God's word, but below that is God's revelation through human reason and God's revelation in creation. All 3 of these are kind of the Christian understanding of how we understand truth. What about social justice? I said social justice because it's atheistic. It denies objective truth. Truth is therefore subjective. Your truth, my truth, but not the truth. So notions of objective truth and reason and logic and evidence, people that believe in this ideology will actually say those are discredited tools that oppressors employ to maintain their power and their hegemony. They will deny things like science, things like the effectiveness. They'll just say these are tools that oppressors are employing to maintain power and hegemony. However, they will say this. They will say that we can gain some knowledge of truth, in quotation marks, through victims based on their lived experience of oppression, because they have greater insight than oppressors, because they've lived through oppression in a way that oppressors haven't. So they then essentially become a voice for what is really true. They have greater knowledge of truth. This is actually called standpoint epistemology in critical theory studies. So it's an axis. Now, one of the things you see is that social justice ideology, it accrues a lot of benefits to victims. So this is just one of them, right? Victims have a greater access to knowledge of the truth. They'll tell you the way things really are. I remember when I was first confronted with this ideology, probably, 10, 15 years ago. No, it wasn't that long ago. It was sooner than that. But some of my Christian friends came. I had written something in a blog that they took offense at. I think it was on the issue of race. And they were offended enough to come and talk to me. And they brought a black person and an Asian person and a Hispanic person. And it was an interest. I thought we'd have a discussion. I wanted to learn. I'm like, what's wrong? What did I say? I want to correct it if I said something wrong. I was really open. I wanted to have a discussion, dialogue, etc. They didn't want to have a talk. They wanted to tell me what was going on. And it was kind of like, you sit down, you be quiet. And it wasn't just me. It was my mentor, Darrell Miller, who's in his 80s, given his life to working with the poor all over the world. Didn't matter what color, creed. They wanted us to sit down, shut up, let me tell you the way it is. It was the first time I'd ever been in that kind of environment. I thought, what is going on? This is weird. But what I found out was that because these were people of color, they could claim a status of victim, meaning they could claim greater knowledge. In other words, knowledge wasn't accrued through experience, degrees, wisdom, these other ways that we might think of knowledge being accrued. It was accrued through the status of being a victim. We'll tell you the way things are. You listen to us. Well, who wouldn't want to be a victim? I get to tell everyone the way things are. But victimhood also accrues a sense of righteousness, as I've said. You can be seen as morally innocent. It's very attractive, right? Power and authority will tell you the way things are. Victims in this ideology have a sense of authority. So because victimhood in the ideology of social justice accrues so many benefits, everyone all of a sudden wants to be a victim, right? It's some people call it the Victimhood Olympics. We're all kind of competing against one another to see who's got the greater victim bona fides. And if I can't show that, then I'll create some kind of hoax. Even to, we think of Jussie Smollett, right? Resorting to kind of hate crimes hoaxes to convince people that they've been victims. So it's crazy what's going on right now. In fact, it was interesting. I heard a talk recently by, what's his name? Andy Ngo. He's a journalist from Portland, Oregon, Vietnamese American, and he's done probably more to kind of get inside of Antifa and study what's going on in this movement. And he got to know many of these Antifa members, found out that many of them are kind of middle-class white males, not poor, middle class, but many of them had transitioned to female, transgender transition. And he was puzzled by that. Why did they kind of all transition, And one of the things that he speculated was that they struggled being white males because they were the oppressors, right? But if they could claim to be transgendered, it at least gave them one step on the ladder of victimhood that they could hold on to. It gave them a place it gave them it helped them to accrue the benefit of victimization. Well, I am I'm unfortunately out of time. I might pick this talk up because I think it's important to get through a few of these points after lunch, and we'll do it as best we can. But I think what we'll do now is we'll just pause it there. We'll come back. We'll look further at this ideology, and then we're going to have to get into how do we respond? What do we do in the face of this ideology, which is now not fringe, but really dominant, in shaping our culture and society around us. So let's take a break. Let's have lunch, and we'll go from there. Okay. Yeah, come on up. Yeah.